The water at the edge of the fast ice does not move the way open sea moves. It sits. It is black in the way that only water beneath ice can be black, not dark, but depthless, a hole in the world where light goes down and does not come back. On the morning this begins, a hunter named Akkaluk stood at that edge with his harpoon still resting in the crook of his arm, and he watched the black water swell without breaking, the way it swells when something large has come up beneath the surface and is deciding whether to rise. Then it rose. It broke the water without a splash. That is the first detail, and every man and woman who saw the thing across 70 years returned to it, unprompted, in the same quiet way. It came up without sound, the water parting off its shoulders like oil off glass. What surfaced was not the blunt, whiskered dome of a seal. It was a head, a long head, narrow, hairless, and pale. Pale not like snow, which has blue in it, but pale like the underside of a fish, like the skin of a drowned man 3 days in the cold, a grey-white that seemed lit faintly from within. The skin was smooth, too smooth. No fur held the frost, no scar broke the surface. It shed the water completely, and where the water left it, the skin did not glisten. It was matte and dry-looking and wrong. The shoulders came next. Akkaluk said the shoulders were the moment his hands stopped working. A seal has no shoulders. A walrus is a barrel. This thing had shoulders that turned, that rolled forward as it lifted itself, and beneath them 2 long arms. Arms, he insisted, not flippers, that reached and found the lip of the ice and took hold of it. The hands were webbed. The fingers were long, longer than a man's, and between them a translucent membrane stretched thin enough that the grey light of the sky came through it faintly pink. Those hands closed on the ice, and the creature did not haul itself up like a seal throwing its bulk. It pulled, slowly, with intent, the way a swimmer pulls himself from a pool, testing his weight, in no hurry, entirely in control. And then it stopped. Half out of the black water, its long body still trailing down into the dark, and it turned its head and it looked at him. The eyes were flat. That word, flat, appears in account after account, in Kalaallisut and in Danish, and later in the clipped English of a whaling clerk from Dundee, and none of them seem to have borrowed it from the others. The eyes were flat and lidless, set forward on the face rather than to the sides, wide-spaced, black through and through with no white showing, and they did not blink because they could not. There was no membrane to draw across them. They simply held open, wet and dark and steady, and they fixed on the hunter's face, not on his harpoon, not on the movement of his body, the way a hunted animal reads a threat, on his face, on his eyes. It looked at him the way a person looks at another person they are trying to remember. Akkaluk did not throw the harpoon. He said in the account taken down from him decades later that he could not have told you in that moment why he did not throw it, only that it would have felt like throwing iron at something that was already reading his mind. The 2 of them stayed like that, the man on the ice, the pale thing half risen from the water for what he called the length of a long breath, though he admitted he was not breathing. And in that stillness he understood something that he could not afterward defend and could not afterward shake, that he had not found it, that it had come up here at this seam between the water and the ice, at this precise place where a man was standing, because a man was standing there, that it had surfaced to be seen. Then it let go of the ice. It slid back, no thrash, no dive, just a smooth withdrawal, the long body folding down into the black, and the last thing to go under was the face, still turned up toward him, the flat eyes still open as the water closed over them, and the surface sealed and went depthless again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. He stood there until the cold in his feet became a kind of pain that reached his knees, and then he walked back to the sled, and he did not tell the others for 2 days. I want to be precise about what I am describing, because the temptation with a story like this is to let it swell into something operatic, and the truth of it is quieter and far stranger than any monster. What surfaced at the ice edge was not enormous. The witnesses who saw it fully, later, ashore, put it at the length of a tall man, perhaps a little more, not a leviathan, not a serpent, nothing that would fill a Renaissance map-maker's margin. It was roughly the size and shape of a person. And that is the thing that has kept me inside this material for the better part of a year, longer than I have spent on anything else. Not that it was huge, but that it was close to human, and calm, and curious, and that it moved between the water and the ice as easily as you move between two rooms of your house. The Greenland ice edge, the Signer, is one of the oldest continuously watched places on Earth. For 1,000 years, people who could not afford a single error in observation have stood at that boundary, reading the water for breath, for shadow, for the particular disturbance that means seal or narwhal or walrus. These were not credulous people. They were the most exacting naturalists our species has produced, because being wrong at the ice edge meant dying at the ice edge. When a hunter like Akaluk told you that what he saw was not a seal, that he knew every animal that broke that water, and this was none of them, that is not a campfire story. That is a specialist telling you he encountered something outside a taxonomy he had inherited across 40 generations, and he was not the only one. That is what turns a single strange morning into the thing I have to show you, because the same creature, the same pale skin, the same long arms, the same webbed hands and flat, unblinking, forward-set eyes, was described by other people, in other decades, in other dialects, along the same stretch of coast. People who never met, people who could not have read one another's accounts, because most of those accounts were never written down, and the few that were have a habit of disappearing. They found it not rising from the black water, but lying on the ice, beached and breathing. The earliest account I can date with any confidence comes from the spring of 1874, from a settlement on the Umanak coast, recorded not by a scientist, but by a Moravian catechist named Samuel Kleinschmidt in a letter he never sent. I found it folded into the back matter of a language notebook held in the Danish National Archives, misfiled under grammatical examples. He was collecting Kala Alisut vocabulary. He wrote down a word he could not translate, offered to him by an old woman who used it for a thing she said her father had helped drag off the ice when she was a girl. The word did not mean seal. It did not mean man. When he pressed her for a description, she gave him one, and he transcribed it faithfully in the careful hand of a man recording something he did not believe. Skin the color of a drowned person, no hair anywhere on the body, arms longer than a man's arms, hands with skin grown between the fingers, and eyes that faced forward and did not close. She said it lay on the ice for 3 days. She said it was not hurt. She said it was waiting. Now hold that description in your mind, because I want you to watch what happens to it across the next 60 years. In 1889, a Danish whaling mate named Peder Brandt, invalided home from a season out of the station at Rittenbank, gave a deposition to a maritime insurance clerk in Copenhagen, an ordinary document, the kind generated whenever a crew loses time or equipment. Brandt's ship had lost 4 days. In explaining why, he described a shape his boat crew found grounded on a low pan of ice at the floe edge, which they first took for a dead man and rowed toward to recover, as sailors were bound to do. He wrote that it lifted its head. He wrote that its skin was pale and smooth and utterly without hair, that its hands were webbed to the second knuckle, and that its eyes were flat, lidless, and set to the front of the face, and that no man in the boat would touch it, and that they rowed back and would not speak of it, and that the loss of 4 days was because 2 of the men afterward would not work. The clerk noted in the margin, in a different ink, the single Danish word overthrow, superstition, and filed it. Kleinschmidt's old woman and Brandt's boat crew were separated by 15 years, 2 languages, and 150 kilometers of coast. Neither could have known of the other, and they gave the same creature, the same pale hairlessness, the same webbing, the same forward, lidless, unclosing eyes. That is the detail that stops me every time, the eyes that face front. Seals do not have forward-facing eyes. Predators do. Things that hunt by judging distance do. Things that look at you do. I gathered 11 of these accounts before I stopped counting them as separate and started counting them as one. A trader's ledger from Egedesminda in 1901 with a marginal note about a hunter who brought in no meat because he had spent his hunt sitting beside a thing on the ice. A missionary report from 1912 that mentions, in a paragraph about local beliefs the writer wished to discourage, a pale swimmer that comes ashore to be found. A single line in a 1927 expedition diary held at the Arctic Institute, written by a Danish surveyor who was not looking for monsters and had no reason to invent one, describing what his Inuit guide refused to approach on the ice, and describing it in exactly the words you have now heard 4 times. Pale, hairless, webbed, eyes that would not close. And here is what none of them could do. Not one of these witnesses could tell you what the creature did. They could describe it down to the webbing between its fingers. They could draw it, and some of them did, and I will come to the drawings. But when you follow the account past the moment of encounter, the record goes soft and vague and finally silent, as though the memory itself had been worn smooth. A man could tell you he sat beside it for a full day. He could not tell you why. He could not tell you what passed. He would say only that afterward he was tired in a way that did not pass, and that he did not like to think of its face, and then he would stop talking, and the person recording him would write that the informant became reluctant, or agitated, or would not continue. This is the part I cannot explain away, and I have tried. The descriptions of the body are stable across 50 years, and 2 languages to a degree that folklore is never stable. Folklore drifts. Folklore embellishes. Tell a monster story across 3 generations, and it grows scales, grows teeth, grows to the size of a whale. This one did the opposite. It stayed exactly the size of a person, exactly as calm, exactly as pale, and every single teller lost the same piece, not the look of it, but the meaning of it, what it wanted, what it did. As if the encounter left a hole in the person precisely where the answer should have been. And then there is the sled team. I have spent longer on this single episode than on any other in the file because it is the only one where the thing did not simply lie on the ice and get left there. In the winter of 1908, according to 2 separate sources, a trading post daybook and the later testimony of a woman who was a child in the settlement, a group of hunters found one of these creatures beached near the ice edge, alive, and made the decision no one else in 50 years of accounts had made. They did not row away. They did not leave it. They lashed it to a sled and they hauled it inland, away from the water, toward the settlement. 6 men and a dog team. The daybook records their departure. It records the day they were expected back. And then it records, in a hand that grows harder to read, that they returned 4 days late, without the creature, without an account of where they had left it, and that from that winter forward, none of the 6 would speak of the journey to anyone, not to the trader, not to the missionary, not to their own families. One of them, the woman remembered, would sit for hours drawing the same shape in the snow with a stick and rubbing it out, a pale figure with long arms and forward eyes. He drew it perfectly. He never once said its name because, and this is what she told the person who finally recorded her 60 years on, she did not think he had one, and she did not think he had forgotten it. She thought there had never been a word for what happened between the men and the thing on the sled, and that the men had come back knowing there never would be. They could draw it. They could not name what it did to them. And that gap, that clean surgical gap between the face they remembered and the meaning they lost, runs through every one of these accounts like a seam through rock. Which forces a question I did not want to ask and cannot stop asking. What kind of encounter leaves the eye intact and empties the memory behind it? What comes ashore, lets itself be found, sits calmly beside the people who find it, and takes from them not their lives, but the one thing that would let them tell you what it was. I have spent longer than I should admit trying to find one physical thing. One bone, one plate of glass with silver on it, one page of ink written the night it happened. Because a story that survives only in the mouths of the dead is a story anyone can dismiss. And I did not want to hand you a legend. I wanted to hand you an object. And this is the part of the work that unsettles me more than any single sighting, because every time I followed the trail toward a thing I could hold, the trail did not go cold. It went clean. Something had been there. And then, very deliberately, it was not. Start with the museum. In the accession ledger of a Danish natural history collection, I will not give the shelf because the current staff have been generous and do not deserve the correspondence. There is an entry dated to the last week of a spring in the early 1880s. It records the receipt of a crate shipped from a station on the West Greenland coast. The description in the intake column is 4 words long. Large marine specimen, preserved. There is a catalogue number assigned to it. There is a note that it was placed in a cold storeroom pending examination by a curator who was, that season, in Iceland. The number exists. You can find the number. What you cannot find is the specimen, because the next relevant entry, made 11 months later in a different hand, records that the crate was opened for inventory and found to contain packing salt, sailcloth, and nothing else. Not a partial specimen, not a decayed one, nothing. The margin note, in the careful understatement of a 19th century registrar, reads only "never received," though the crate itself plainly had been. Both things are written down. The crate arrived, the crate was empty, and no one ever reconciled the 2 sentences, because to reconcile them you would have to explain what leaves a sealed box between 2 ledger entries. I want to be honest about how mundane the ordinary explanations are because they are genuinely available. Specimens rotted. Shipping was catastrophic. A soft-bodied thing packed in insufficient brine in a cold hold could liquefy and be sluiced away by an embarrassed porter who would rather write nothing than write failure. Salt was reused. Crates were mislabeled and their contents shelved under other numbers and lost by clerical drift for a century. All of this happens. All of it is documented across the history of natural collections, and any one instance proves nothing. What I cannot make peace with is the pattern, because the crate is not the only place the object should be, and is not. Go to the trading post, the station that logged the 6 men and the sled, the daybook I described to you, the one whose hand grows harder to read. That daybook does not survive as an original. It survives as a partial transcript made by a later administrator because the post itself burned. The fire is real. It is in the colonial records of the district, dated, attributed to a stove or a lamp, unremarkable. Trading posts burned constantly. Timber, blubber oil, long dark winters, open flame. But the fire took the storeroom where the station's older papers were kept, and it took, if the inventory of losses is to be trusted, a set of drawings that the missionary had collected from the settlement. Drawings, the loss inventory says, of local subjects made by hunters. Local subjects made by hunters. That is all the description we have of the images that a man once cut into the snow with a stick and rubbed out, and that someone, at some point, persuaded him to put on paper instead. They burned. The one place the pale figure was rendered by a hand that had stood beside it went up in a winter fire, and the loss was recorded in 4 bland words, and the district moved on. And then the journals. The whaler, the Danish master whose sightings I quoted you earlier, the man who wrote it, moved as a man moves who does not wish to be seen moving. He kept private diaries across decades at sea, and after his death, his widow was known in the town to possess them. A regional historian working in the 1930s on the whaling trade wrote to her asking to see them. Her reply survives. It is short. She wrote that she had burned her husband's journals, all of them, in accordance, she said, with his wishes, and that she was sorry she could not help. His wishes. A man who wrote for 30 years, who filled book after book, instructing his wife that the books must not outlive him. People burn diaries for 100 private reasons: shame, debt, affairs, ordinary secrets. I know this, but I keep returning to the shape of it. The bone leaves the crate, the drawings leave in the fire, the words leave in the widow's stove. 3 different mechanisms, 3 different decades, 3 different kinds of people: a registrar, a fire, a grieving woman, and at the end of every one of them, the same absence, the same clean gap, the exact gap the sledmen carried home behind their eyes. The thing that empties memory in the men also, somehow, empties the record around them. I am not claiming it reached out and did this. I am telling you that when you lay the losses side by side, they rhyme, and I do not know what to do with a rhyme like that. This is how a thing vanishes without a conspiracy. No one need suppress it. You only need a specimen too soft to keep, a coast too remote to photograph, a language the collectors did not read, a witness reclassified as a fantasist, and time which files the whole business under spoilage and moves on. There is no vault where the pale swimmer is hidden. There is only 100 small silences that each look like nothing until you notice they all point the same way. Which brings me to The Last Hunter and to the sentence I have been carrying since I first read it, because everything in this account funnels down into it like water into a crack. He was an old man when a Danish ethnographer recorded him, one of the last who claimed a living memory of the beachings, and he had given the flat, patient answers the ethnographer expected: where, when, how big, how it moved. And then, unprompted at the end, he said a thing the ethnographer wrote down because he did not understand it. He said, the creature never fought when it was found. It never fled. It came ashore, he said, in order to be found. That was the whole of its purpose in coming, and it lay still and let the men gather around it, and it looked up into their faces one by one. And the old man asked, not the ethnographer, not himself, the air. If it only ever came ashore to be found, then what was it looking for in the faces that found it? He did not answer. The ethnographer did not answer. I have read that page more times than any other in this entire body of material, and I cannot answer either. But I notice that the question assumes something the whole record quietly confirms. It was not hunting. It was searching. It surfaced at the edge of the black water, hairless and long-limbed and the colour of dead skin, not to feed and not to flee, but to be looked at and to look back, slowly, deliberately, into one human face after another, as though checking each one against something it remembered, or something it had lost, or something it was waiting to find. And every time the face it studied went home, unable to say what had passed between them. Every time the man could draw the eyes and never name what the eyes wanted. 60 years, 100 years, dialect after dialect, and the same gap. It came ashore to be found. It searched the faces of the finders. And whatever it was looking for, across all those decades, at all those ice edges, the record does not tell us whether it ever, in any single one of those still grey encounters, found it. I have spent the better part of a year inside this material, and I want to be honest with you now, in the way I would be honest with myself at 3 in the morning when the reading no longer feels like research and starts to feel like company. There is a version of this story that dissolves the moment you hold it up to the light, and I owe it to you to build that version as carefully as I have built everything else, because if I hide it from you, I am doing to you exactly what the record has done to us for a century. Here is the ordinary explanation, and it is a good one. The Greenland ice edge produces corpses. Every spring the leads open and the pack breaks, and things that died beneath the ice come up into the light, and what comes up is bloated, hairless, bleached and swollen out of any natural shape. A drowned seal that has been down long enough loses its fur in sheets. Its skin goes the grey-white of a wax candle. Gases lift the limbs and distend the body until the flippers splay like hands, and decomposition slackens the face until the lids draw back and the eyes stand open, flat and lidless and patient, exactly as every witness described. A dead thing does not fight when it is found. It does not flee. It comes ashore because the current and the tide bring it ashore, and it lies still and lets the men gather, and it looks up into their faces because the dead, undignified by rot, cannot look away. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it genuinely, deeply persuasive because it explains the sameness across the decades. The hunters were not copying a legend. They were describing the same natural process that the same cold sea performs on the same animals in every generation. And of course, it looked identical from Thule to the Danish stations because putrefaction has no dialect. That accounts for the body. I concede the body. What it does not account for is the breathing. Over and over, in accounts separated by 60 years and 1,000 kilometers and men who never met and never could have, the thing was found alive, beached and breathing. Slow, shallow, deliberate breath, watched by men who had gutted 10,000 seals and knew precisely what a living animal and a dead one look like. A corpse does not track a moving face with its eyes. A corpse does not, at the end, when the sled team hauls it inland over the ice, go so quietly and so willingly that 4 grown men who did it never speak a full sentence to their own families again. Decomposition explains the shape. It does not explain the silence it left behind in the people who touched it. It does not explain why a man could sit for an ethnographer and draw the eyes, render them perfectly, and then set down the pencil and be unable to say a single word about what those eyes had asked of him. Rot does not do that to a witness. Something else did. And so I am left where the old man left the ethnographer and where the ethnographer left me, with a question that will not close. You understand now why there is no bone. The crate logged into the museum and opened empty. The specimen that was never received. The trading post that burned in the one winter that mattered. The widow at Upernavik feeding her husband's journals into the stove page by page, not in grief, her neighbours said, but in a kind of hurry, as though she were finishing something he had started. No single act of suppression. No conspiracy worth the name. Just the ordinary way a thing gets erased at the edge of the world. A report never translated out of Kala Alisut. A photograph that fogged in the developing tray. A witness quietly reclassified in the margin of a report as a fantasist. An old man's testimony filed under folklore because the alternative was unthinkable to the man doing the filing. The record did not lie to us. It simply thinned and thinned and thinned, until all that remains is the shape of an absence, and the drawings, and the gap between what the men could draw and what they could not name. I keep returning to the smallest, coldest detail in the whole body of material, the one I almost did not include because it frightens me in a way I cannot defend to a skeptic. It is that the thing came ashore to be found, not to feed, not to flee. Every account, stripped of its terror and its dialect, agrees on that structure. It surfaced where men were, it made itself found, and then it searched. It looked into one face and then the next, slowly, checking, the way you might scan a crowd at a harbour for someone you were told would be waiting, someone you would know when you saw them. And every face it studied went home altered and mute, which means that in all those grey, still encounters, across all those decades, whatever it was searching the faces for, it did not find. Because it kept coming back. It came back to Thule, and it came back to the Danish leads, and it came back to the Ice Edge generation after generation, and it lay down in the snow and let itself be gathered, and it looked up, still searching, still not finding, still coming ashore. I think about that when I close the folder. I think about the last hunter, the one whose question ends the record, and I think that maybe he understood the terrible arithmetic of it better than any of us. that a thing that only comes ashore to be found is a thing that is looking for one particular face, and that it has not found it yet, and that it is patient in the way only the truly old and the truly cold can be patient. And I picture it the way the first man ever to see it must have, at the moment the black water broke, the smooth pale skull rising without a ripple, the long limbs hanging in the dark below, the flat, lidless eyes clearing the surface and turning, slowly, deliberately, toward the deck, toward the lantern, toward the face leaning down to see what had come up out of the sea. It watched him back. It always watched them back. And the question the old man asked the empty air, the question I cannot answer and the record cannot answer, and you now carry out of this film whether you wanted it or not, is not whether the thing was real. The bodies were real. The silence was real. The question is quieter and worse than that. If it only ever came ashore to be found, and if it searched every face and turned away and came back and searched again, then somewhere out at the edge of the black water it may still be surfacing, still rising smooth and pale into the grey light, still looking, one face at a time, for the one it has not yet found. And I do not know what happens on the day it does.